Lawrence Douglas, who will be tonight's speaker, has dedicated his lifetime research to investigate how the legal systems of 3 different countries, the United States, Germany, and Israel, have approached the question of how to bring perpetrators to justice. He currently is the James Garfield Professor of Law, Jurisprudence and Social Thought at Amherst College. His first monograph, The Memory of Judgment, Making Law and History in the Trials of the Holocaust, focused on the trials at Nuremberg and of Adolf Eichmann, Klaus Barbie, and Ernst Zündel. His main focus has been on what he calls the didactic uses of such trials as tools for responding to mass atrocities. He has further, and this is the really scary part, co-edited 13 scholarly books, written over 24 scholarly articles, and numerous book reviews. His highly productive academic output is accompanied by 2 novels, as well as a satire of Stieg Larsson's thrillers, which he called The Girl with a Sturgeon Tattoo, published under a pseudonym. And a book containing delightful parodies of academic life and other absurdities called Sense and Nonsensibility, Lampoons of Learning and Literature, co-written with Alexander George, a colleague, and full of great advice on how to tackle the many absurdities of academia. His most recent book, which will be available for sale outside, however, is dedicated to a much graver case, which has nonetheless been accused of its own absurdities. In The Right, Wrong Man, Lawrence Douglas examines the many failures and eventual success in trying Ivan, or John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian who lived through the Holodomor, the starvation imposed on Ukraine by Stalin, only to be captured by the Germans. Then, however, Demjanjuk became a guard at the infamous Sobibor extermination camp. After the war, he managed to relocate to the United States. When suspicions arose that he could be a gas chamber operator at Treblinka called Ivan the Terrible, he was tried and convicted in Israel, but set free once it became clear that he was a different Ivan. Yet he was eventually tried in Germany for his actions in Sobibor. Douglas masterfully dissects the workings of the 3 legal systems and how and why Demjanjuk was first accused of the wrong crime, but finally convicted for what he actually did. Yet on display is not just John Demjanjuk, but also the oftentimes depressing or infuriating and seemingly absurd handling of Nazi crimes by the various jurisdictions. And while the Demjanjuk trial was frequently criticized as not living up to the importance of the Nuremberg and Eichmann trials, Douglas clearly demonstrates that this was not the case, and that instead the trial of John Demjanjuk proved to be a turning point in our understanding of what can, in fact, be punishable by law. I would like to come back to the opening talk this week. Eva Moses-Kor talked about her meeting with Hans Münch, a former Nazi doctor and colleague of Joseph Mengeles. Münch was tried in Krakow, Poland, after the war, but he was acquitted as the court found that while he was working at Auschwitz, he did his utmost to treat the prisoners as humanely as possible and also save prisoners from the gas chambers, according to the court. This example illustrates a truth that apparently sometimes is too difficult to hear, that even in the most extreme of circumstances, there is an opportunity, however slim, to act morally. No guard was ever punished by the Nazis for not killing. And yet, too frequently, claiming to just having followed orders had stood up as a defense in court. However, Douglas points out that a machine cannot run without its small constituent parts. Demjanjuk was rightly convicted not because he committed wanton murders, but because he worked in a factory of death. He was convicted of having been an accessory to murder for a simple and irresistible reason, because that had been his job, end quote. I would now like to ask you to welcome Lawrence Douglas, and I'm very much looking forward to his talk.
First, I'd like to thank Philip for that really terrific introduction. And I'd also, of course, like to thank Paul Kupperman for making this talk possible, and also for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for also making the talk possible. And it really is an honor and a privilege and a pleasure for me to be able to address you tonight. I want to actually start the talk tonight with a story about memory. And this is a story that comes from the mid-70s from Hamburg, Germany. And in Hamburg, Germany, in the mid-70s, prosecutors tried a number of SS officials who had run a camp called Czerniki. The Czerniki camp was, again, an SS facility. It was located near Lublin, Poland. And during the Holocaust, the SS had recruited about 5,000 Eastern Europeans, mostly Ukrainians, who had been taken as prisoners of war by the Germans. And the SS then took these largely Ukrainians and they trained them to be death camp guards. Jews were even kept on hand at this Czerniki training facility so that the trainees could practice their techniques on live subjects. And one of the famous alums of this Czerniki camp was John Demjanjuk, about whom Philip mentioned and about whom you will hear more in my talk tonight. In 1975, German prosecutors tried a handful of SS men who had overseen the camp, the commandant of the camp and a number of other SS officials who had basically run it. And during this trial that took place in Hamburg, a Jewish survivor who had been living in the United States and was called by German prosecutors to come testify at the trial, she identified one of the SS men as Obersturmbannführer Klink. Unfortunately, though, no other survivors could identify this SS lieutenant colonel by name. And so the witness's identification was really crucial. But prosecutors were concerned because they had never encountered a record of an SS Colonel Klink at Czerniki. And they were also a bit perplexed by the odd name. And it came out that apparently the survivor had confused her Czerniki tormentor with another man. And those of a certain age will, of course, recognize this man as the bungling, monocled colonel who presided over the fictitious Stalag 13 in the American sitcom Hogan's Heroes. And alas, in the survivor's mind, the Colonel Klink of TV had become the Lieutenant Colonel Klink at Czerniki, and she continued to insist that there was actually a great deal of physical similarity between the two. Now, I actually begin this story because far from idiosyncratic, I think it actually represents a crucial problem that trials of the Holocaust have faced. And to appreciate this problem, I think we need to step back and consider how the atrocities of the Holocaust, how they fundamentally challenged and unsettled conventional understandings of criminality. Conventionally, the law, if anyone goes to law school and takes a course on criminal law, you'll see that the law tends to construe crimes as deviant acts, that is, as acts that are committed by individuals, typically against other individuals, and these acts are understood to harm community norms and community ideas of order. Now, of course, different legal systems reach different conclusions about which specific acts constitute such a threat to social order, but I think it's fair to say that all legal codes condemn certain foundational wrongs such as murder. And in the face of these kind of foundational wrongs, the modern nation state is obviously authorized to respond very aggressively. It's authorized to mobilize and deploy its investigatory and judicial resources to the end of apprehending, prosecuting, and ultimately punishing the perpetrator of such crimes. And if some of you have studied Western political theory going all the way back, probably the most famous example of this is Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. But if you go back and study a lot of Western political or legal theory, you know that the state is typically understood as the bulwark of security and order. The state is the force that basically protects us from the violence of other strangers. Nazi crimes exploded this model, and it exploded the model's assumption that private violence from others represents the most basic threat to the fabric of social life. because Nazism revealed the terrible capacity of the state itself to turn reprobate, to turn bad. Now, this was a phenomenon that the German philosopher Karl Jaspers designated with the term Verbrecherstaat, which simply means the criminal state. And Jaspers' term illuminated how Nazism had transformed the state into the principal perpetrator of crimes, into the very agent of criminality. In his opening address at Nuremberg, the chief American prosecutor, Robert Jackson, who, as some of you might know, he was an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court who temporarily left his work at the Supreme Court in order to run the Allied prosecution at Nuremberg. Jackson framed the legal challenge that's posed by the Verbrecherstaat in the following terms. He said, civilization asks whether law is so laggard as to be utterly helpless to deal with crimes of this magnitude by criminals of this order of importance, end quote. And this just happens to be an image from the Nuremberg, the main Nuremberg trial, which is known as the IMT, or the International Military Tribunal. And as some of you might know, it's currently celebrating its 70th anniversary, the Nuremberg trial. And Nuremberg and the trials that followed it, its progeny, they offered, I think, a distinctive answer to the question or to the challenge that Jackson recognized. And Nuremberg insisted that the law, that it was adequate to the task of dealing with the crimes of the Verbrecherstaat, of the criminal state, but that the effort would require extraordinary legal effort and innovations. That is, mastering the crimes of the criminal state, the Verbrecherstaat, it would require new jurisdictional principles, it would require unorthodox evidentiary conventions, and most of all, it would require new categories of wrongdoing. And these categories of wrongdoing, or incriminations is the technical legal term, these categories would have to be sufficiently flexible and sufficiently capacious in order to handle crimes that had really spanned a continent and had lasted over half a decade and had enlisted the participation of tens of thousands of perpetrators and had been supported by a complex organizational and also logistical apparatus. Of these new legal categories, or these new incriminations, two of them stand out. The first is crimes against humanity, and the second is genocide. Nuremberg was not, in the first instance, a trial about the Holocaust. If any of you have studied Nuremberg, you might be familiar with the fact that Nuremberg, the main charge that was brought against the 21 defendants who were in the dock at Nuremberg was that they had committed a crime against peace. That is, that they had launched a war of aggression in violation of international law. But nevertheless, even if Nuremberg was not in the first instance a Holocaust trial, it did offer judicial recognition of this new incrimination, namely crimes against humanity, and this was the term that was used at Nuremberg to designate state-sponsored atrocities. And it was this term, this idea, that provided the principal legal channel by which most of the evidence of the Holocaust that was presented at Nuremberg came before the judges there. The second important legal innovation, the second novel incrimination, is genocide. And this is the term that was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944 to describe the Nazis' treatment of Jews in the occupied territories of Europe. Lemkin had been, he was himself a Polish Jew who at the time was working as a legal advisor to the U.S. War Department, and he took the ancient Greek word for group, genus, and he wedded it to a Latin word for killing, side, like homicide, parricide, and he came up with this new term. And the new term, in his mind, was meant to designate something distinct from just mass murder, and something more grave. In Lemkin's terms, it was meant to designate, again, this is a quote, a coordinated destruction of essential functions of the life of groups with the aim of annihilating the group itself. Now, the effort to punish Nazi atrocity also gave rise to the creation of special courts, such as the IMT. Some of them were of an international character, Nuremberg. Some were of a domestic character, and some were kind of a hybrid character, having elements of a domestic national tribunal and an international court mixed together. For example, right now, if you look at the trials that are taking place in Cambodia of former participants in the regime of the Khmer Rouge, that's kind of a hybrid court that mixes elements of an international tribunal and a domestic national court. And I think it's actually fair to say that the very field that we now call international criminal law, in large measure owes its entire existence to the law's effort to grapple, in the first instance, with Nazi mass atrocity. And these important legal innovations, they ultimately authorized the prosecution of a lot of perpetrators of the Holocaust. I think it tends to be a kind of almost an assumption that, oh, the overwhelming majority of people who were associated with the Holocaust never were brought to justice. In a certain regard, that is true. But in another regard, there were many, many people brought to justice in multiple Holocaust trials across a number of different countries. And these included persons who were principal architects of the genocide, to zealous bureaucrats who had carried out the genocide, to hands-on exterminators. But these legal innovations notwithstanding, I think it would be wrong to think that these new developments made the act of conducting Holocaust trials an easy matter. And to the contrary, I think these trials, they invariably pose very, very complex issues that bring us back to our point of departure, namely the story about flawed memory with our Colonel Klink. At Nuremberg, the prosecutors structured their case around captured documentary evidence, not around the testimony of eyewitnesses to Nazi atrocity. And here's just an image that gives you a sense of this trial by document. This is part of the prosecutor's office of the researchers assembling some of the documents that were going to be submitted as evidence before the Nuremberg tribunal. The prosecutors at Nuremberg worried that Nazi crimes were so extreme that survivor testimony would be dismissed as exaggerated or perhaps even as fabricated outright. And I should also say that the decision to privilege documents over the voice of survivors, that politics also played a role. The British, for example, they worried that highlighting the suffering of Jews would complicate efforts to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. And so they supported the idea of, that is, British prosecutors supported the idea of keeping Jewish survivors excluded, keeping them off the witness stand. So again, the bulk of the evidence that was submitted by prosecutors at Nuremberg consisted of captured Nazi communiques or captured Nazi documents. And again, this material was considered harder and more reliable than eyewitness testimony. And in this regard, Nuremberg was a trial by document, a case that was really largely absent the testimony of eyewitnesses. Now, whatever else we might think about this prosecutorial strategy of privileging document over the voice of eyewitnesses or the voice of survivors, it had one dreadful unintended consequence. Nuremberg became, to borrow the memorable formulation of Rebecca West, a British writer who covered the Nuremberg trial for the Daily Telegraph, this writer, Rebecca West, famously characterized Nuremberg as a citadel of boredom. Because really what you had is you had prosecutors spending all their time reading hundreds, even thousands of pages of documents to the court. And even the judges themselves, if you look at the diaries that they kept contemporaneously, they were bemoaning, they were saying like, the human life that's passing me by, listening to the prosecutors read these documents. And some of the critics of the trial actually even went one step further. And they argued that by excluding the voice of the survivors, Nuremberg inadvertently, not on purpose, but inadvertently, it was almost completing the work of the perpetrators because it was leaving the victims absent. They were leaving the victims anonymous and erased from memory. Now, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 in Jerusalem consciously tried to correct Nuremberg's missteps. As you recall, Adolf Eichmann was, I guess what you could describe him as the kind of the logistical mastermind of Nazi genocide, or particularly with respect to the deportations of many Western European Jews to death camps. And he was tried. He had been kidnapped from Argentina, where he had fled. He was kidnapped by the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, brought back to Israel, and he stood trial in Jerusalem in 1961. And the Eichmann trial was very consciously organized around the testimony of survivor witnesses. And the Israeli chief prosecutor, who was the Israeli Attorney General named Gideon Hausner, Hausner openly acknowledged that winning a conviction and securing the death penalty against Eichmann were not the chief purposes of the trial in his mind, or at least not the exclusive purposes of the trial. More generally, Hausner very specifically aimed to use the trial as a tool of creating what he described as, quote, a living record of a gigantic human disaster, end quote. And he intended to create that living record by telling Holocaust history through the lived memory of survivor witnesses. And this just happens to be Abner Kovertner, probably not a name that's familiar to many of you, but he was both a survivor of the Holocaust and then later in his life became one of the leading poets in Israel. So very, and for Israelis of the time, of that period, a very familiar literary figure. The approach of the Eichmann trial was actually exceptionally successful. This trial, because it told history through the lived memory of survivors, it managed to both rivet a domestic national audience in Israel, but perhaps more remarkably, it riveted an international audience, specifically in Germany and in the United States. And by Germany, I really mean West Germany at the time. Indeed, Hausner, the prosecutor, and other Israeli officials were actually astonished by the intense amount of media attention that was focused on the Eichmann trial. And I think it's fair to say that largely as a result, the Eichmann trial became in many ways the great Holocaust trial. That is, the trial that most successfully placed memory in the service of justice and also vice versa, justice in the service of furthering the interests of memory. But nonetheless, this strategy of Hausner's, it was not uncontroversial, because people asked the question, well, is it right, is it proper to push a trial in the direction of becoming what almost looked like an oral history project? Is a criminal trial the right venue for honoring the memories of those who have endured unspeakable atrocities? The Eichmann trial showcased then the power, at least in my mind, of using the trial in the service of memory. But the dangers of that approach, the dangers of the approach were dramatically exposed in the other great Holocaust trial that was staged in Israel. And this was the trial of John Demjanjuk that began in Jerusalem in 1987. And this was about a quarter of a century after Eichmann's execution. As Philip mentioned in his introduction, John Demjanjuk was born Ivan Demjanjuk in the Ukraine in 1920. He served in the Soviet Red Army. He was taken a prisoner of war by the Germans in 1942. And according to Demjanjuk, that's basically where the story ends. He basically insists that from the time that he was taken a prisoner of war by the German, he remained a German prisoner of war from 1942 basically until the end of the war. If we jump forward from the, in Demjanjuk's biography, right after the war, he bumped around in a bunch of displaced persons camps in Germany. He finally emigrated to the United States in 1952. He became a U.S. citizen, a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1958. And some of you might be familiar a bit with his history. He ended up working as a machinist at a Ford plant. He ended up, and again, this was a time when blue-collar, unionized UAW jobs permitted the somewhat effortless move into the middle class. And he assembled a kind of nice middle-class life, lived in suburban Cleveland, had 3 children. And there he was until 1975. And in 1975, American prosecutors became aware that after 1942, it appeared that Demjanjuk had not simply whiled away the rest of the war in a POW camp, but in fact, as I mentioned at the outset, that he had actually been selected to train at this Triniki camp. And moreover, American prosecutors came to identify Demjanjuk as, again, not just any old death camp guard, but in fact a particularly notorious death camp guard. A death camp guard who was known at Treblinka as Ivan Grozny, or Ivan the Terrible. And even if you go back and look at the Eichmann trial, if you look at the records from the Eichmann trial from 1961, even the transcript there has survivors of Treblinka talking about this notoriously sadistic death camp guard known as Ivan the Terrible. And so American prosecutors identified him as Ivan the Terrible. But then, of course, it raised the question of what happens with this information in the United States with the American prosecutors. Well, for complex jurisdictional reasons, American prosecutors could not try someone like a Demjanjuk on criminal charges. These were crimes that took place outside the United States, in which the perpetrator at the time was not an American, in which the victims were not Americans. And so in a way, American prosecutors had their hands tied in terms of trying to bring criminal charges against a person like Demjanjuk. But they weren't entirely powerless, because what they could do is they could bring civil charges against him. That is, they could charge him with having lied on immigration forms and then work to denaturalize and to deport him to a country that then could try him. And so what happened in the case of Demjanjuk is that he was denaturalized in the, again, if any of you recall this, in by far the most highly publicized denaturalization proceeding in American history. And he was ultimately sent to Israel to stand trial as this notorious Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. Now, the accusations against Demjanjuk in Israel, they were gruesome. But on the other hand, they very easily fit into what I've described the standard model of criminality. That is, Ivan the Terrible was your paradigmatic villain. He was your paradigmatic monster. He was a kind of drunken, sadistic sociopath, a total deviant, a really evil guy. And after 18 months of trial, Demjanjuk was convicted, and he was ended up being sentenced to death. And he was sentenced to death largely, almost exclusively, based on the testimony of eyewitnesses, that is, Treblinka survivors who swore with absolute certainty to recognize in Demjanjuk their former guard. And here's an image of Demjanjuk on trial in Jerusalem. So, 10 survivors of Treblinka swore with certainty. Moreover, they emphasized the fact that we're not talking about having just fleetingly caught glimpse of this guy. We're not talking about as if we had just been in a car accident and caught a fleeting glimpse of the person who was driving the car. This is someone who we saw day in, day out for months on end, and his image is in a sense almost kind of burned into our retina. Yet they were all wrong. Evidence emerged during the appellate phase that really conclusively indicated that Ivan the Terrible had been a completely different Ukrainian named Ivan Marchenko. And this Ivan Marchenko was also Ukrainian, as I said, and he bore, if you look at pictures of him, which the court did get access to, he bore a small but not entirely negligible similarity to Demjanjuk. Now, what made this thing also into kind of like your ultimate legal perfect storm is that the information also wasn't entirely exculpatory. It made clear that Demjanjuk had served as a death camp guard, but at a completely different death camp, Sobibor, not at Treblinka. So the Israelis were now in this terrible bind because they recognized they were about to execute the wrong guy as Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka, and yet they also realized that this guy still had been a, what we could call maybe Ivan the not-so-hot of Sobibor. And so they kind of struggled with this, and ultimately, in July of 1993, in what I think was ultimately a brave and a necessary step, the Israeli Supreme Court threw out Demjanjuk's conviction. And for complicated reasons, he then returned to the United States, where he was then subjected to an entirely fresh round of denaturalization proceedings. And this time it was based on the unequivocal evidence that he had served at Sobibor, not at Treblinka. And after, again, many more years of legal struggle, as he brought various appeals and the appellate process ran its long and slow course, he was ultimately deported to Germany, where he arrived in November of 2009. And there in Germany, in Munich, he was tried as an accessory to the murder of 28,000 Jews during his time at Sobibor. And he was convicted in 2011, and in 2012, he died while his case was being appealed. Now, if you'll bear with me, I thought I would just read you a little bit from a description from the first day of the trial. Is that okay? From this very handsome book that's priced to move. So this was the first day of his trial in Munich. All at once, the chatter in Gerichtssaal, courtroom 101, dies down as a door at the side of the chamber swings open. Flanked by two medical orderlies and a court-appointed doctor, the defendant is maneuvered into the courtroom in a wheelchair. A sky blue blanket drawn all the way up to his chin covers his legs and body, and a blue baseball cap juts low over his brow. His eyes are closed, and it's unclear whether he is asleep or just fending off the explosion of camera flashes. Photographers, cameramen, videographers clamor in front of the wheelchair, shooting away in a frenzy, as if Gisela Bündchen had just sashayed into the Munich courtroom. Demjanjuk's mouth hangs open. He appears to mutter words or moan in pain. Cameras flash. A helpless octogenarian, wheelchair-bound, grimacing before a relentless onslaught of publicity. It is not a sight to burnish the criminal justice system's reputation. Demjanjuk's re-entry into the courtroom after the midday lunch break, only adds to the carnivalesque atmosphere. Gone is the wheelchair, replaced now by a monstrous orange ambulance gurney. Demjanjuk lies flat on his back, a white blanket drawn, so it appears from my vantage point, over his head. It seems that during lunch, the defendant has died. A corpse has been wheeled in to stand trial. Cornelius Nestler, a professor of criminal law representing relatives of persons murdered at Sobibor, jumps to his feet. Nestler is keenly aware that the prosecution of Demjanjuk is more than a colloquy over evidence and law. It is a competition over images that will be transmitted around the world. Excuse me, Nestler says, I'd like to know why he's positioned like this. A team of 3 doctors briefly confers and announces that the defendant has said he's uncomfortable sitting up. Well, would it be possible, Nestler asks, at least to raise him? The picture this projects is, after all, most disconcerting. The court announces a recess to discuss the matter, and soon a compromise is reached. The defendant may remain on the gurney, but will now be propped up at a 45-degree angle. Appropriately enough, the rest of the first day is devoted to medical testimony concerning Demjanjuk's fitness to stand trial. Three physicians take turns describing his various elements, but all 3 agree that Demjanjuk is physically and psychologically able to stand trial. The physician's testimony concerning the defendant's basic fitness would be completely unremarkable were it not for the grotesque pantomime playing itself out as a backdrop. For all the while, Demjanjuk enacts a play of mute decrepitude and suffering. His face wrinkles in a silent grimace. He grips his forehead. He struggles to moisten parched lips. He stiffly moves his arms and then opens his mouth wide like a dying elephant seal. The bizarre juxtaposition of the doctor's steady assurances and the patient's silent distress is almost the stuff of Monty Python. And journalists in the room exchange glances. The consensus is that the defendant is faking it. The defense is overplaying the martyr card. Demjanjuk's performance lends new meaning to the term show trial. In the coming weeks, Demjanjuk will remain inert, baseball cap pulled low over his brow, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, but the grimaces, the frowns of pain, the silent moans, they will cease. Someone has passed them the message to tone it down. So, in contrast to both the Eichmann trial and Demjanjuk's Israeli trial, the trial in 1987, one thing that was most distinctive about the Munich trial was this was a trial that was almost entirely absent the memory of survivors. By 2009, when the trial started, there were only 8 Sobibor survivors left on planet Earth, and none of them really had ever been able to identify Demjanjuk, except right before the trial started, 2 of these 8 now came forward, one in Russia, the other in the United States, now saying, we think we can positively identify him. Can we now come and testify at the trial in Munich? And perhaps predictably enough, you can imagine the German prosecutors said, Nein, danke, because the last thing they wanted to risk was a repeat of the disaster in Jerusalem. So we have then a trial that was almost entirely without the memory of survivors. So what was the trial based on? Well, in a kind of very strange way, it turned into a trial by history conducted with the testimony of professional historians. Now, this wasn't entirely novel. For example, even if you go back to, let's say, the Eichmann trial, the very first witness who testified at the Eichmann trial was not one of the survivors, but in fact was a professor of history from Columbia University named Salo Baron. And Baron basically offered a kind of a lengthy history lecture about anti-Semitism. And if you look, for example, in this country, the office within the Department of Justice called the Office of Special Investigations. So this is a special office that was responsible for these denaturalization and deportation proceedings against people like Demjanjuk, against the so-called Nazis next door. If you look at that office in the Justice Department, they had a completely unorthodox organization, something that you'd never seen before in the Department of Justice. Namely, what they had done is instead of having lawyers and investigators, which is the typical model, they basically got rid of all their investigators and they hired what looked like a small history department. It was a bunch of professional historians that they brought in to work closely with the lawyers. Now, this wedding, this uniting of lawyers on the one hand and historians on the other, again, it hasn't been uncontroversial. There was a very prominent French historian of the Vichy period, that is the Vichy, of course, during the Second World War when France was partially occupied by Germany. This historian named Henri Rousseau, and he was asked to testify at trial of this Maurice Papin. And Papin was a former French budget minister, so a very prominent figure in France, who was then ultimately convicted of complicity in crimes against humanity for acts he had committed during the Second World War. And when asked to testify, this famous historian, Henri Rousseau, he actually declined. He didn't want to testify because he worried about what he called a judicialization of the past. That is, he was very concerned about viewing history through these these kind of rigid legal categories. Now, I certainly am not one to deny Rousseau his right not to testify at these trials, but I do think that his attempt to kind of erect some kind of clean divide between law on the one hand and history on the other, I think it's completely untenable. It makes no sense in Holocaust trials. Because when it comes to these state-sponsored atrocities, these complex state-sponsored crimes, questions of history are inescapable because these crimes, by definition, they deal with large communities in actions which have been perpetrated over a broad, again, geographic space and a large temporal space as time, a lot of time as well. So if we return to Demjanjuk's trial in Munich, we see that really basic legal questions couldn't have been answered without the insights of professional historians. Now, I'll try to kind of make clear exactly how the historians made possible his conviction. So we have to kind of recall two critical facts. The first was that Demjanjuk was being tried not for murder, he was being tried as an accessory to murder, for having served at Sobibor. The other thing to bear in mind is even though prosecutors had lots of evidence showing that he had been a guard at Sobibor, so there's no doubt that he had been a guard at Sobibor, they had absolutely no evidence whatsoever about his personal conduct at Sobibor. No evidence about that at all. And the prosecutors got around what might have been a really serious prosecutorial problem with a rather brilliant theory. And the theory was quite simple, and yet it was also quite irresistible. And the theory was very specifically tailored to the realities of Sobibor. And Sobibor, again, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, this is one of the pure extermination camps that the SS had erected, along with Treblinka and a third one called Belzec. And we can almost imagine the prosecutor's theory as a working by logical deduction. That is, it kind of worked from the premise that all Sobibor guards participated in the killing process. Demjanjuk was a Sobibor guard, therefore Demjanjuk participated in the killing process. Now, again, deductive reasoning, so the conclusion had to be true if those premises were true. That second premise, that Demjanjuk had served as a guard at Sobibor, as I've said, solidly established by documents. We know he was a guard there for a 5.5-month period of time. That was beyond doubt. The problem, again, as I said, was that we had no evidence about what he had personally done as a guard. So it's the major premise that we really need to look at. All Sobibor guards participated in the killing process. Now, if you think about it, this is kind of an aggregate historical claim. And you can only prove that claim by having a comprehensive, a really exhaustive study of Sobibor and of its guards that had trained at the Striniki camp. This is an example, this is an image from the Sobibor camp. And one thing that I want to emphasize is, I guess two things I want to emphasize about this image. First, if you're having trouble reading it and thinking like, oh my God, why does English suddenly look very unfamiliar to me? It's because it's in Dutch, of course. And the only reason that I used the Dutch image was because during the time that Demjanjuk was at Sobibor, almost all the victims at Sobibor were from the Netherlands. And so kind of in memory to them, I kind of used a Dutch image. And the other thing that we can say about this, without knowing anything more about the Sobibor death camp, is it's small. This is not a particularly large facility. I think very often we have these images from, I think our paradigmatic image of a death camp, we think of Auschwitz, and we kind of, we've seen these like aerial shots of barracks extending to the horizon. Well, this is a pretty small facility. And in fact, I think the comparison to Auschwitz is really quite telling. So Auschwitz, for example, was a hybrid facility. That is, it was part death camp, and it was also part labor camp as well. And if you look at the number of persons who were deported to Auschwitz, the number was about 1.2 million. And of those 1.2 million, you have about 100,000 survivors. So if you think about it, if you think about Auschwitz as a disease, if you use some kind of medical analogy, it's an unbelievably lethal place. I mean, it has an over 90% lethality, right? For 1.2 million, only 100,000 people survive. Now, I want you to compare that figure with the pure death camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Of those three camps, there were about 1.5 million, almost exclusively Jews that were sent to those camps. 1.5 million. Of those 1.5 million, the total number of survivors was 125. That's it. And that was a crucial fact for the prosecution, because they were basically able to say that Sobibor had one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to destroy human beings. So, for example, in the case of Auschwitz, which had a very large guard force, 6,000 guards ultimately served at Auschwitz, it is possible to imagine that a guard could come forward and say, look, I never participated in the genocidal process. I was dealing with the labor part of the camp. But in the case of Sobibor, the historians were able to say that's impossible, because all this camp was doing was producing corpses. The other crucial thing that the historians were able to prove with this trial was that all the guards at Sobibor were generalists. And by that I mean, it's not as if one of them was just folding the laundry or the other one was just a cook. They all participated in the killing process. And that, again, was by virtue of the fact that this was basically a pretty bare-bones operation. Over 250,000 people were exterminated at Sobibor. They were exterminated by the total number of SS people at the camp was never larger than probably 20. About 15 to 20 SS people, and then another 100 to 120 guards like Demjanjuk. And that's it. And so because it was sort of a bare-bones operation, everyone participated in the well-run destruction process. And this, again, was something that was very carefully established by the historians. And so by establishing that Sobibor was simply a killing machine, and that all guards were generalists who participated in the killing process, the court was able to then conclude that it doesn't matter that we don't know what Demjanjuk was doing on any particular day. We know he had to be an accessory to murder because that was his job. That left one crucial question still unanswered. And that crucial question was, had he participated voluntarily? Because remember from the outset, something that Philip had said and something I mentioned earlier, namely that Demjanjuk, he was not a German. He was never a member of the Nazi Party. This is a Ukrainian, and a Ukrainian had been taken as a prisoner of war by the Germans. So can we say with certainty that he had acted voluntarily in serving as a death camp guard? Now, technically speaking, again, for those of you who might have studied law or interested in studying law, voluntariness is really what we call a kind of a legal question. It's something that really only a court can answer. So a historian can't tell a court whether someone served voluntarily. It's just like a ballistics expert can't look at a gun and tell a judge whether a murder was committed with premeditation simply by looking at a gun. But here again, the work of the professional historians, it was crucial in paving the way to the conviction. because the historians who testified in Munich estimated that of the 5,000 collaborators, that is, these Ukrainian, other Eastern European collaborators who worked as death camp guards, up to about 1/5, at least 1/5 actually, fully 1,000 men had deserted their posts. Now, they were also able to say something about why they deserted. Probably had very little to do about moral qualms about genocide. After Stalingrad, a lot of these people thought, you know, maybe collaborating with the SS wasn't the smartest move, especially when we can start to hear Red Army artillery shells, you know, in the background. And so at some point they decided, well, maybe we're going to switch bets back to the other side, and they took off. What were the consequences of fleeing? Apparently, according to these historians, if a guard like Demjanjuk fled with his weapon, well, then he was assumed to be trying to join up with partisans, and then the consequences were draconian if he were caught by the SS. He would probably be shot. But if he simply left his weapon behind and took off, there were very clearly documented cases in which the recaptured guard would be punished quite lightly, and then sooner rather than later would be once again performing his guard service duties. Now, the court concluded from this that Demjanjuk had had a meaningful opportunity to desert, and then the failure to do so then indicated that he had served voluntarily. Now, we can debate this point, and in the question and answer, I'd be happy to talk at greater length about it. I actually probably think it was the correct decision on the part of the court. But again, I thought what this emphasizes is this kind of really interesting collaboration that made a question of individual guilt turn on the testimony of historians describing the larger patterns of behavior of people in positions such as Demjanjuk. Now, at the end of the Munich trial, when Demjanjuk was convicted, as I mentioned, I did hear expressions of sympathy for this guard, who after all was 91 at the time of the conviction. And I heard people come along and say, you know, there was never any evidence that he was cruel or that he was vicious. And then I heard other people who had also observed the trial, you know, respond, no, don't let that frail old man routine fool you. I'm sure that deep down this guy was a total absolute monster. But to my mind, both of those views miss the crucial point. The fact that the Munich court convicted in the absence of evidence of personal bad acts accounts in my mind really for the importance of this ruling and really even for its greatness. Because to convict only in the presence of proof of evil or in the proof of viciousness is again to treat the Holocaust precisely as this kind of garden variety criminal case in which criminal acts is understood as committed by deviants or by sociopaths. That's the kind of ordinary model that I started out with at the beginning. Demjanjuk's Munich trial, by contrast, understood that mass killing is not the result of personal evil acts. It's the result of an exterminatory process. And when it comes to state-sponsored atrocities, guilt is not to be measured simply by acts of cruelty or by acts of nastiness or sadism. Guilt follows function. And that was the simple but the great insight of the Demjanjuk conviction. So thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to answer your questions.